Today, we're going to be talking about the Lumix S1H. It's Panasonic's full-frame mirrorless camera. Specifically, the S1H is the one focused on video, filmmaking, cinema, whatever you want to call it. It's Panasonic's version of their hybrid cinema camera. But before we get into that, I want to talk about something else that's been on my mind lately that I think is really important. The fear of failure can be really, really detrimental to your overall success. A lot of projects, you go in and you're so worried about the outcome and how things are going to turn out that that process in itself leads to the failure that you're fearing. And it maybe won't be the exact fear. Maybe you think it'll be a total bomb, it'll never work out. And I'm definitely one to recommend working through taking the proper precautions, planning out the worst case scenario. But if you over criticize your own work and you over fear what may be from the project you're working on, it can end up leading to it being less successful than if you were to roll the dice a little bit, maybe take a risk, try something, experiment. Gambling can pay off, and it can also completely fail and you lose all your money. But with creative risk-taking, I think the reward is well worth it. You definitely have to be smart, you have to be strategic, but when you over-worry about your own work, your own ability, you over-criticize, you ask other people, you're constantly worried about making the perfect product based on making every single person happy, I think you end up watering down the final result. This is really common if you look at Hollywood and some of the films that have been released recently that kind of feel like they're done by committee, where they go around and they ask every single person what they think, would make them happy or what they would like. And ultimately, all of those things are delivered and the product is underwhelming because it's giving people what they want, or maybe it's somehow subverting their expectations and that's not what they want either. And none of it seems authentic and genuine of someone just trying to tell a good story and make the best piece of content possible. It feels a lot about minimizing risk for the sake of profit or the fan base. I think this is true on a giant Hollywood scale, and it's just as true on a small independent project scale. If you're not willing to take a risk sometimes and just go with your gut, go with your instincts, try something that you think might work, even if other people might say that'll never work, it'll never turn out, that'll be awful. You risk trying things that could be really, really successful. This happens all the time with YouTubers and content creators. Oftentimes you'll hear stories, myself included, producing content that you try really, really hard and you take all the time in the world to make it perfect, and you listen to feedback and you work it until you think it's perfect and it's going to get 1 million views, and you roll it out there and it gets 100 and it's underwhelming, and you feel like, why did I spend all that time, effort, and energy trying so hard on something I knew was going to be a home run, and it ultimately turned out to be a total loss. Other times, there's projects that you might not even really think are all that great, or they're just kind of whatever, and you'll just do it to try something and see what happens. Might as well work at it. And that can be like lightning striking. It just can take off overnight, and it can be that kind of radical success you never expected. And maybe you look at it in hindsight and you go, wow, I wish I had tried harder. I wish I had done this, or the color, or the focus, or X, Y, or Z, whatever it is, fill in the blank. But you put it out there, you took a gamble, and it paid off. And oftentimes, this is the mentality I like to take with my approach to content. Try your best, work your hardest, but don't overanalyze to the point of fearing failure and then it ultimately being the reason it does fail. Oftentimes, it's the things that are slightly imperfect, or that maybe are a little off the wall, or not quite going to make everybody happy. Maybe they're a little controversial, or maybe they're a little questionable, or maybe you just don't know what people are going to think, and the only way to find out is to put it out there. I think that is the type of stuff that we should be encouraging people to do, to experiment, to be creative. That is what we're all about. If we always just deliver what's expected, I mean, we're not offering anything new. We're not moving things forward, and we're not testing boundaries and seeing what can be done with $1,000 cameras or $2,000 cameras, or what one person is able to achieve. Try stuff out, experiment, take a risk. Don't fear failure so much that it either paralyzes you into not doing anything, because that clearly will not breed success. If you're so afraid of failing and you never try, then you've already failed to begin with. And if you're so afraid of failing that you need it to be perfect and you worry about making every single person happy, then you'll probably end up making no one happy. And this is the unfortunate reality of just making content. Oftentimes it is more beneficial, more successful to take a little bit of a risk. Put yourself out there, try something new, and see what happens. I think that's really valuable because it's what I always have to tell myself. Every time I'm working on a project and I get second doubts and I'm overanalyzing and worrying, oh, maybe it's just garbage, I won't even put it out there. Well, then it's a failure immediately because it's a total loss. If you put it out there and people hate it, that's still okay. It's valuable feedback for the next go around. And you tried and you produced content and you made something, which making something is better than making nothing. Most of the time. I think all the time. Even though there's movies and TV shows and things people look at and say, it would be better if this never existed. But at least the people tried. At least the individual worked at something and made something, put it out there into the universe, created something new from nothing. What's most incredible about video and photography and just creative professions in general is that we're making new stuff every single day, hopefully every single week, every single year, whatever the frequency is, but we're putting new stuff out there. It would be rather bland and boring to only look at old material, the famous painters of centuries ago, where you look at them and you say, yes, it's a masterpiece. But if that's all we have, and we're not creating new masterpieces, what's the point? And how will you ever know if it's a masterpiece unless you put it out there? And if it's not the first time, you can always try again, and you can try again, and you can try again. It's a lot of failure oftentimes that leads to success. You have to try a lot to see what works and just to find out maybe the stuff that challenges your expectations. Maybe you thought something was going to be perfect and going to be that instant success. And it turns out it's probably not. You have to go through the failure and learn those lessons the hard way to actually get there, usually. And then it's usually the things that are surprising, unexpected, that make you go, oh, that's what I should have been doing this whole time. So don't let fear hold you back. Don't worry about failing, that you don't take risks, that you don't try, that you don't move forward. Honestly, it can just delay things to the point where they end up being a failure because they're too late. What was a great idea on the first day becomes a terrible idea 6 months later, just because of the evolution. What was at the core was lost because it's gone through so many hands, it's changed so much, the vision has been lost, and it doesn't have that spark of ingenuity and passion behind it anymore because it's just past its time, missed its moment. What could have been great is now doomed to fail because of the fear of just not putting it out there and seeing what happens. So I truly believe in that. Do what you think is good. I always say, if at least you're happy and you like it, then at least one person likes it. That's better than zero. And oftentimes when you're trying to make everybody else happy, you end up making no one happy. If you're trying to please a certain audience or make a certain person see it and love it, oftentimes there's a lot of lost in translation between what someone says they want, and then if you deliver that, it doesn't live up to their expectations or isn't exactly what they wanted. I think focus on yourself first, what you think is good, what you think is quality, what you would like to watch. Part of the reason I make the content the way I do is the type of content I like to watch. It's a challenge to make the content that I don't watch for the sake of making other people happy. If I'm not making myself happy, then why am I doing it? Just to get a bigger audience, to get a lot of views, and at the end of the day feel empty about it because I'm not proud of it and I don't like it? You always got to try your best and make yourself happy, but don't worry so much about what other people think or what they might think. A lot of times the projections you think in your head about what other people are going to think are just that, just in your head. They're not actually true. I think the more that we all think about these things, remind ourselves, and just put ourselves out there. Ultimately, the better it is. I promise we will get to the S1H very soon, which we can start talking about it right now. So I've got the S1H. I've technically had it for a day and a half. It showed up yesterday via FedEx from Lens Rentals. It's a rental. So I've had it for a day and a half, but basically 1 day's worth of shooting. I used it today on an actual project to see how it lived up to the workload. I'm very familiar with the GH5. I've had the GH5 basically since it came out, which has been, 3 or 4 years now. Also very familiar with the Ursa Mini, the Ursa Mini Pro, the Ursa Mini Pro G2. So whether it's hybrid shooting or cinema shooting, I'm very comfortable with both those systems. Shot with them a lot. I've also shot with Sony cameras, Canon cameras, you name it, I've probably played with it. And the S1H, which is right here, feels a lot like a GH5. Although, I will say, first thing I noticed, it sure is big and it sure is heavy compared to the GH5. Now granted, it's not as big as an Ursa Mini Pro. I'm not going to say that it is or that, it's ridiculously oversized, because it's not. But it's right at the point where I would say this is almost too big to hold in your hand for a hybrid. It's right at the edge. And granted, I don't have the biggest hands. I'm sure if you have giant hands, this feels a lot better. But the grip is very deep and it is very heavy. It's a full frame camera, as it should be. But if you're used to the GH5 and you've been used to Micro Four Third and you're looking to upgrade to full frame, the S1H is not like the Sony cameras. Sony, in my opinion, with the A7S and A7S II, make very small cameras. They feel tiny. The S1H in comparison feels massive and gigantic. Is it something you would get used to? Absolutely. Most things based on ergonomics, you do adapt to. Just becomes normal and it feels the way it feels. But if you're coming from a GH5 or any kind of mid-size mirrorless camera, the S1H is a lot of camera. And with the 24-70 lens that I have on here, it's quite heavy and would be exhausting to hold all day long. Now, granted, it has internal stabilization, so that can help if you do get a little shaky throughout the day. And I'm talking about, I've shot all day with the Ursa Mini Pro, which is even heavier than this. So again, this isn't to the point of exhaustion where the S1H is impossible to hold. But compared to a GH5, you're probably going to have a lot easier time just holding and moving around with a GH5 in a more comfortable way, considering a GH5 with a 12 to 35 is half this size, half the weight probably. I don't know exactly, but it is noticeable and something that I would just point out right away. Don't expect this to feel the same or be pocketable, but none of them really are pocketable. I don't know whose pockets are that big anyway, but definitely not the S1H. The next thing I noticed about the S1H is this mushy shutter button. So the trigger here, most cameras will have a click. The GH5 has a click when you pull the shutter and you release the shutter. It clicks, the button clicks. So you have a little bit of a haptic feedback to know that you've taken the photo. Even if you're in the silent mode, the button itself still has a click, a mechanical click. The S1H doesn't have that. It's got this kind of mushy button that, did you press it halfway? Did you press it all the way down? It doesn't really click back to you to know that you've taken the photo. This is fixed if you have it in, the loud mode, and not that it's really loud, but just not silent. If you put this camera in silent, it's really hard to tell you're even taking pictures other than the frame blacks out briefly, so you know something was snapped. But other than that, there's no real feedback to the shooter to know, hey, a picture was captured. And it's kind of hard to know exactly when the photo is captured when the screen's blanking out as well, because you don't actually see the photo that was captured because it's black. Now, if you have the sound on and you get that click from the sound that's made by the camera to resonate that a photo has been taken, that is a lot better. And it's a nice way to shoot so you know that you got what you wanted to capture photography-wise. And also, too, there are many times where I was recording video where I would push the button, both the record button up at the top and the shutter button, both feel the exact same. They're just kind of mushy, and it's a little underwhelming to click because you always have to second guess. Is it starting recording? And then you look for the red dot and you look, okay, yes, it is recording. Did I stop recording? Make sure there's no red dot on the screen, and then, okay, you've stopped recording. It's a minor little nitpick, but I wanted to go through all the things that caught me off guard as being kind of irritating or frustrating and things you would have to get used to that seem relatively unique to the S1H. The other thing that felt kind of weird right off the bat is on the back of the camera, you have the menu button, which on the GH5, again, a lot of this is what you're used to and what you feel, what feels right. But I imagine a lot of people looking at the S1H would be coming from the GH5. Anyway, on the GH5, the menu button is kind of depressed. So there's a nice little groove to where your thumb sits and it feels like it just nestles right in there. On the S1H, it's almost protruding. So it kind of bubbles up a little bit. And this feels very odd to find a good place for your thumb to rest. Again, I'm sure you would get used to it over time, but it did catch me off guard as feeling kind of odd and weird. And the menu button in general is just kind of, it feels kind of finicky and not quite as sturdy as other camera systems where you know the tactile function of what you want to happen is happening. Up is up, left is left, right is right, down is down. The menu set on this it doesn't feel quite right in the same way. Also, in terms of the mushy shutter and how things get recorded, on the LCD screen, the record icon is in the bottom left-hand corner, which is, again, very different from the GH5, which is in the top right. So many times I found myself looking at the top right, going like, wait, why am I not recording? And then having to remind myself, oh, it's in the bottom left. You would definitely get used to this over time. It would become second nature and habit. But it is odd because it seems like it's in an odd place. I'm sure there's some camera systems out there that put the record, in the top left or the bottom left or the top right or the bottom right. But just in general, it felt like it's like the total opposite corner of what I'm used to. And it's going to take a little bit to get used to it if I end up sticking with this camera for the long term. This one was a little odd. So on the side here, this card door, first of all, it has a release button. So again, I'm comparing it to the GH5 because that's the reference point. I'm sure a lot of people have shot with it. The card door in the GH5 just pops open. You just pull it and it pops. On the S1H, you have to release this lever and then pull it the same way, which is kind of, you're going two different directions. You're pulling the button one way and then pushing the card door another way. This can be a challenging maneuver, or at least slightly irritating. Probably would get used to it, but it is an extra movement that I imagine keeps the card door a little bit more secure, but I've never had a problem with that on the GH5, so I don't know why we need a latch here. I think it should just pull and pop like most cameras. Anyway, that's not the main issue with the card door. The main issue with the card door is this kind of clasp here for where you'd put the neck strap that you loop through here, which I don't usually shoot video with a neck strap because it just kind of gets in the way. If I was traveling and doing photography and I wanted to take a break from the heavy camera, I would probably have the neck strap on there just so I didn't have to hold the camera the whole time. But with video, it often just gets in the way, so I usually take it off. But anyway, with this can easily flip down and then get in the way of the card door. Hopefully you can see that of where it just, the clasp blocks the door. So you have to do this maneuver where you flip this up and then you can close it again. Minor design inconvenience, but I did think it was weird that this was not, not tested, because that easily, it naturally wants to rest down and then it's always in the way and you have to move this to close this. These are super nitpicky things, but they're things that I want you to know because you probably know all the great things about this camera. You know all the good stuff that it can do, all the stuff I knew before getting it. But that's why I think renting is so valuable, because you get to see all this kind of nitpicky stuff that you're like, oh, wow, that's kind of weird. I wonder why they did that. Next, good to know is that the 4K 60 mode, it's called out in the specs, but a reminder is that it is 420 if that matters to you. There is a 10-bit 4K 60 mode, but the color sampling is 422. Not the hugest thing, but it is good to know that when you're going through all the menu options for all the different frame rates and bit rates and the codecs, there are all these little tiles, and each combination is its own tile. So there's actually some crazy amount of codecs and frame rate options on here, and you have to scroll through all of them to get to each other. So you could be scrolling and looking for one very specific codec, and you might go right by it, or you forget where it's at. You can set like kind of favorites and filter down the list, but just going from the quick menu and going through, there are a lot of different codecs on here, which is great. There's a lot of variety, but just the menu needs an update. The way Lumix, Panasonic have been doing these menus on the GH5 and the S1H is just getting out of hand. They really need to separate resolution into its own choice. Pick, do you want 4K? Do you want 6K? Do you want 1080? Separate frame rate into its own choice. Do you want 23,976? Do you want 30? Do you want 60? Do you want 120? What frame rate do you want? And then how do you want that recorded? Do you want it, 10-bit, 8-bit, all I? Have that as a separate choice as well. This is exactly how Blackmagic has done it on their menus, and those menus are fantastic. More cameras need that same functionality where you're picking these things independently. There's no reason resolution, frame rate, and the recording format and the codec all have to be tied into one setting, and then you end up with, theoretically, an infinite number of combinations. The more frame rates, the more resolutions, the more codec options they're putting into these cameras. It just makes the menus really kind of irritating to navigate, and something that you should know. Also good to know about the S1H as a reminder, which you probably already do, but just as a reminder, 4K 60 is a Super 35 crop of full frame. There isn't a 4K 60 mode that is full frame. So if you bought the S1H thinking that you were going to get full frame 4K 60, well, that's not an option. It's only Super 35 or APS-C. Those are relatively equivalent. Now, this is bigger sensor format than the GH5, which is micro four thirds, which is another step smaller than Super 35. But with a speed booster, that puts the field of view right up there at Super 35 on the GH5. So theoretically, if you wanted this just for 4K 60, thinking you're gonna get full frame, you can get the same 4K 60 with the GH5 and a speed booster. So just keep that in mind, because it is something that can kind of sneak in there that it's not full frame 4K 60. Next up, you'll notice full frame rolling shutter is a problem on the S1H. Just panning the camera back and forth and doing a little wiggle test, you can see the jello, you can see the wobbly lines. If you're in Super 35 mode with a faster frame rate, it does go away a little bit and it's reduced, but full frame 4K, like it's got to read that sensor fast, and it's not as fast as you might like because you do get that rolling shutter effect. Something that's probably not a deal breaker because most hybrid shooters have kind of gotten used to this over the years, but if for whatever reason that's a really important factor for how you shoot, do know that the rolling shutter can be severe in high action scenes where there's a lot of movement happening. If things are more calm, you're probably not going to notice it all that much. The battery charger. This is something else that kind of caught me off guard. Again, super nitpicky, but you have the battery, which the battery is, much, much larger than the GH5 batteries. So you've got a big battery on here, and it clips right into the charger as you would expect. But then the charger is USB-C, which is nice and handy that you could plug that into a laptop or some other kind of power adapter. But then it goes into this box, which then goes into your standard, plug for the wall. So the fact that you have two boxes is a little off-putting, considering most battery chargers you're probably familiar with are a box and a cord that goes in the wall. If they had to do this to convert, I understand, but I probably would have preferred being able to plug this cord in here and then a separate one for the USB-C. It's nice that you can charge off a USB-C, but just keep in mind you get one of these situations, which is similar to what the Aperture 120D battery bricks are kind of like, or power boxes are like. It's just a lot of cords, a lot of boxes, and a lot of connections that if you lose one cable or you lose one box, the whole thing's kind of shot. So just a heads up. However, all these things considered, the footage is beautiful. Okay, compared to the GH5, it is very, very nice. Much better dynamic range. The color and the smoothness of the color, specifically in skin tones, is quite pleasing. The content I was filming today was shot in camera with a picture profile baked in. This was a project that didn't really Wasn't going to benefit from the process of shooting log and then having to color grade. It's kind of a fast turnaround thing. So we wanted to get the look right in camera. I ended up going with the landscape picture profile for this one, just because that looked nicest for what we were shooting on the LCD monitor. And I was blown away by how good it looked in the computer after the fact. The skin tones were really nice. And if you've shot with the GH5 before, it is 4K and it does all these amazing things. But one thing with the GH4 and the GH5 that has always kind of not really bugged me, but it's been there as like, it's a subjective thing. The footage has kind of like a texture to it. Some people might call it noise or grain, but there's definitely a distinct like texture to the footage that isn't super smooth and glossy. I don't know a better way to describe it other than texture, because it's not really noise. You can shoot with a low ISO and it'll still be there. With the S1H, I didn't notice that at all. The same kind of perceptible texture that you get with the GH5 is not on this camera. I have to do some more shooting to see if it comes up or if it's, you know, something that maybe I'm just not paying attention to. But I did notice right away just how smooth and clean the footage looked while still being very, very detailed. Am I pixel peeping at it and putting charts up? No, we were shooting footage for a project, so it looked really, really nice, and I shot everything at 4K. I didn't go 6K. I shot a combination of the 10-bit stuff and the 8-bit stuff, again, for that kind of flexibility of like higher quality color in the one situation, but then maybe the ease of use and the speed and efficiency of 8-bit. And again, having the 4K 60 at 8-bit is just a little bit easier to edit. So I really, really did like the footage. However, the LCD screen on the S1H is pretty terrible, I would say, by today's standards. It's basically looks like the same screen or very similar to the one that's on the GH5. The menu and everything are very, very similar. And just the way everything's laid out and the color and sharpness of the LCD is not all that great. In fact, when I was looking at it on the camera, I was kind of underwhelmed at how it looked. I was just like, oh, that's kind of okay. Once I got the footage into the computer, it looked much, much better. So thankfully, what you're capturing is great. But if you're expecting to kind of see on the back LCD something beautiful and breathtaking and, oh my gosh, this is so incredibly gorgeous, you kind of have to save that satisfaction for later when you're actually in editing and you bring it into Premiere or you open it up with QuickTime and you see what you actually shot in all its glory. Now, if you had an external recorder, monitor, display on set, that would probably help so that that screen is taking the burden of being the eye candy. But the little LCD on the back is this, you know, kind of tiny little typical GH5 screen that's not really going to blow you away, I don't think. At least me, I was a little underwhelmed with the LCD screen, but loved the footage after the fact. So I don't know that I have any strong conclusions one way or the other. There was a lot of stuff about the S1H that was kind of a turn-off at first. But again, I think a lot of that is just me being in the GH5 system for so long that all the things that feel familiar and then them not being there on the S1H and the size and the weight and everything about it being a little bit different or kind of clunky compared to the GH5 was off-putting at first. But then once I saw the footage, I was very, very pleased with what had been shot. And I'm pretty sure I didn't do a side-by-side with the GH5 because, again, this was a real project we were working on. So I didn't have time to do side-by-side test footage of S1H versus GH5 with the exact same lenses or lens equivalents and try and get them matchy-matchy and see which one looked better. But at a glance, after the first day of filming with it, being very underwhelmed with the hardware and the design, not very underwhelmed, but just the minor gripes that I pointed out before, and kind of filming with it and being like, yeah, I don't need this camera. The GH5 is fine. And then seeing the footage, I was like, oh, wait, no, this camera is really, really cool. One person I'll call out is Dustin Armstrong. If you've never seen his channel, I would recommend checking it out. He has a lot of stuff on the S1H. He's been shooting with it far longer than I have, so he probably has a little bit more insight to the ins and outs of it. I just wanted to call it out because I've been watching some of his content just to kind of get a better understanding and make sure I'm not missing anything on the S1H. I do like just having hands on the camera, again, renting it rather than feeling like, oh, you've got to watch these videos and make a purchase decision on a $4,000 camera right now, plus this lens is another $2,000. That's a lot of money to put on something that, you know, may not be everything you want or hope or expect. Hopefully this can be a little bit more insight and a little bit of value to you if you're looking at the S1H or something similar. I think this camera would be a more obvious contender if it were cheaper at this point in time. $4,000 is incredibly affordable for everything this does, but it's also starting to look a little bit expensive compared to the R5 and the A7S III. And there are a few features like the slow-mo 4K that I kind of wish maintained that full frame characteristic. You buy a full frame camera to have full frame, and so for them to have a Super 35 mode for the 4K 60 is a little disappointing. Super 35 work? Yeah, absolutely. The Ursa Mini Pro is Super 35. It looks great. The GH5 with the speed booster is essentially Super 35. It looks great. When you have full frame though, you kind of want it to be full frame. So it makes things like the A7S III look a little bit nicer by comparison. Plus you get higher frame rates there. So just something to keep in mind. Although I will say I expect the S1H, this thing is built like a tank. Again, I said it's big and it's heavy, but I also imagine it would withstand a lot of pressure and stress. There's fans in this camera. On the side here, there's a vent, and behind the LCD, which makes it kind of awkward on the back here. Like this raised LCD not being flush with the back is kind of an odd thing design-wise. I understand why they did it so that the camera didn't overheat, but it is a little odd aesthetically to have kind of like a back block that hangs out for where the LCD goes. Supposedly it is weather sealed, and the fan and vents are separate, so that has been a concern about, you know, dust or moisture getting into the camera through these vents and the fan. Apparently that's not an issue, but I don't actually know that 100%. Probably something to look into just to make sure, but that's what I've heard against that specific criticism. Other than that, I'm really pleased to have the camera in hand, and again, for it to be a rental so that I can test it and get my hands on it and not feel that kind of buyer's remorse or that guilt of feeling like I have to love it because I bought it. I feel like, you know, it's a situation where you can be a little bit more honest and critical of the device when it is just a rental. You can see what you love and what you hate. And so far, I don't hate anything. Everything's just been kind of minor irritations that most of them you probably would get used to. But I do really love how the footage is looking so far. And I have to do more tests with Vlog. Thankfully, the S1H is Vlog, not Vlog L. On the GH4 and GH5, it was the Vlog Lite or Little or Lame mode, whatever you want to call it. But basically like a toned down version of Vlog that's just not quite all that great the way that Panasonic implemented it. So I'm glad to see proper Vlog. This is the same Vlog that's in the VariCam. So, you know, for thousands and thousands of dollars for a cinema camera, you can spend, you know, 3 to 4, depending on where the price lands on this in the next little bit, or if you buy it used, right, then you're getting a lot of horsepower in a hybrid camera that I should say does a decent job with the autofocus. I know that's one of Panasonic's main points of contention that most people bring up, that the autofocus is terrible and In photo mode, it works great. Is it as good as a Sony or a Canon? I can't say because I haven't shot with their latest and greatest, but it has eye tracking. It has animal tracking. Is it as good? Maybe not, but in the test I was doing, it was performing remarkably well for photos. In video, wasn't quite the same level of quality, but it did seem to be an improvement for me over the GH5 in autofocus tests I've done in the past with the GH5. I have to do more because it is one of those things like different situations present different problems for the system. I will say, if you are far away from the subject, it will have a harder time recognizing a face or an eye, whereas if you're closer, something like this setup here, where there's a clear giant face in the frame and there's eyes, it does a lot better. So it's situational, it depends, but I wouldn't write it off as if it's like garbage. You can definitely do the eye tracking, autofocus for photography, even at shallow, f-stops like 2.8 is what I was testing with the 24-70. I do have an adapter to modify some EF lenses, so Canon EF lenses There's a smart adapter that Sigma makes. I believe it's the MC11 that adapts Canon EF lenses to the L mount, which is what this is. It's the Leica Panasonic Sigma mirrorless mount, the L mount. Adapters are not known for their reliability in terms of autofocus. So I feel like that's a little unfair to test the 85 Canon EF lens. And it's not even that great of one. It's the Yongnuo really cheap 85mm lens. But it's still a fun lens to play around with because a lot of those lenses that are really cheap are kind of the easy no-brainers to just have in a bag because you're not too worried about, you know, losing this $2,000 lens or spending all this money getting the perfect one. It's like, okay, I'll test that out, see how it goes, and have some fun with it. It's kind of my like travel lens I bring, you know, when it's just taking pictures of the family and whatnot for social media or just like family photos, that kind of thing. Don't have to worry about, you know, some one of the kids bumping it or knocking it or getting it dirty because it's a cheap lens. And I kind of like having those in the bag, just some cheap stuff that doesn't really matter. Although I wouldn't test and kind of go by the autofocus of it, considering the lens is a cheap lens and then I'm adapting it from EF to L. So the 24-70 proper L mount lens I wanted to make sure I had on this as a proper autofocus test, and I'm happy to say it works fairly well. So all things considered, stabilization works great. I didn't notice anything like weird or off-putting about the stabilization, nor did I notice it being like exceptionally great either, but Panasonic is known for good IBIS, so I'll call it out if I notice anything, but it has it and it works. It's got the flip screen, it's got the bigger battery. Basically everything that you would want spec-wise is here, although it just is slightly compromised on certain things like that 4K 60 mode being Super 35, that being unfortunate, or the 6K mode only being 8-bit. But again, that might be a benefit to you depending on your system and what you're editing with. Of course, I should mention the S1H does anamorphic, which is a fairly unique thing. This is on all the marketing materials that it shoots anamorphic, much like that's a very cinema camera feature. Most hybrids don't. In fact, I can't think of many other than the GH5 that also offer proper, you know, anamorphic support. So they've really thought about all the features video professionals would want. So if you are looking for a hybrid, definitely consider the S1H. For me, I don't know. It's not a day one must have, like I love this camera so much I can't give it back. It's more of a, I'll see how things go. But I do really like the footage I'm getting out of it. I have to take the photos in, edit the photos, see those, high resolution, check those out. I will probably have some actual footage and photo samples to go through once I'm actually done. It's just weeding through all the cards and photos and getting rid of some of the junk, keeping the good stuff, and then keeping some of the junk as good examples of maybe where the autofocus missed or something that just didn't turn out all that well because of the situation I was in. So more to come, but that's my day one impressions of the Lumix S1H. Really fun camera to use. And I can't say it enough. The footage was very, very beautiful pulling it in, especially compared to the LCD. The LCD is very underwhelming. Can you adapt EF lenses? I don't even know what's the mount. Oh, so hopefully you heard me say that. Yes, there's the Sigma MC11 adapter, Canon EF to L mount. I have to properly test it. Today, the first day was just all 24-70. It ended up working out well because this is an 82 millimeter filter thread, and I needed a variable ND for the shots we were getting, and so I have an 82 millimeter variable ND fit right on here. Don't quite have the adapters, the step-up rings to get the 85 millimeter lens I have to the 80-82, so it wasn't quite an option to use the variable ND on that lens, which again is a reason why I wish more cameras had the built-in ND system rather than relying on filters, because you just gotta, it always has to be the right size, and inevitably you get a lens that doesn't match up. However, if you are buying filters for the front of cameras, get about as big as you can get. 82 is usually a pretty good size because there aren't many lenses with a larger front than 82. In the past, I have bought 77 millimeter filters, and then inevitably I'll get a lens that's like an 82 or something, and I'm just like, so whenever you can, buy the biggest filters possible. That way you can always step down to the lens or step up from the lens, whichever way it goes. I always end up forgetting, but have big filters so you can use whatever lens you want on them. L mount, and yes, you can adapt anything. Good to know. In the chat, you can't adapt Sony or Micro Four Thirds lenses, Fuji, basically most mirrorless. Yes, mirrorless to mirrorless is very hard to adapt, but it isn't always going to work. I believe you could theoretically. I've seen that they're like the anamorphic lenses have like some of the Siri lenses that are like Micro Four Thirds, and then you can put an E mount on top of the Micro Four Thirds mount. So there's like some scenarios where it kind of works, but in general, don't worry about adapting mirrorless to mirrorless. You'll probably end up getting the wrong thing and it won't work out. But if it's like old school mirror box DSLR style lenses, so the EF or a Nikon F or any older, I don't want to say vintage because these aren't vintage lenses. They're relatively new EF lenses. But now that Canon has RF, I don't believe there's RF to L mount. I don't think that's a thing, but certainly any EF lens you can adapt to the L mount. However, there is some issue where that Sigma MC11 doesn't work on, I believe it's the Leica cameras, but it's not a problem on the S1H. But standard full frame lenses, yes. DSLR full frame, I guess you can, but that's it. Anything with a flange distance of 20 millimeters or greater. And we'll test the Fuji X-T4. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I don't think I'll test the Fuji X-T4. Nothing about the Fuji cameras draws me in. They seem like very fun cameras to use from like the design and hardware, but the features don't really speak to me or appeal to me all that much. Maybe it's just because I'm not getting the right information. I'm not saying they're bad cameras. I just don't know. The Panasonic Lumix stuff is definitely my favorite because of how strong the brand is in terms of video capabilities. Things like anamorphic are so hard to come by in almost every other hybrid camera system that just the fact that they have it is incredible, and that you can, de-squeeze on the LCD is awesome. That's all built right in. Vlog monitoring, and I know that's more and more common on other cameras, but having, log profile on the S1H that is like the proper real Vlog is great, that you can monitor it, that you can load in LUTs as well as, export or monitor via HDMI. That's great. Of course, the S1H, I don't even have a way to test this, but, with the latest firmware, you can record ProRes RAW via an external recorder. I believe it's the Ninja 5. It might be the only one that does it from Atomos. I'm not sure which of their external recorders are supported, but that's a relatively affordable monitor recorder. I think it's only $600 or $700, so it's not the craziest purchase. To have a really good monitor that can record ProRes RAW is not a bad thing to have, although I wouldn't really, I'm hesitant to applaud those kinds of things that rely on other devices. I usually try and look at cameras and systems as like, here's what you can get as the core that will always be with the system, no matter what shoot you're on, no matter what else you bring, as long as you have a battery, a card, and a lens, these things will work. The situations where you need some other piece of hardware or adapter or other thing to make it work in a new way is a nice option to have. Don't get me wrong, it's not like a detriment to the camera, it's only a positive thing, but it also isn't just as easy as like, buy this camera and you'll get ProRes RAW. It's like, well, no, that comes with, you need the external monitor and recorder all in one, which you can say, okay, well, as long as you have that, you can buy it. But a lot of times you might not want to shoot with an external monitor for whatever reason. It might just be too big and bulky, or just for speed and efficiency, you just need to pick up the camera and go. So there are situations like that where I don't think it's an easy way to just write it off and say, oh, well, you can do ProRes RAW, it's fantastic. It's like, yeah, but there's some caveats there. Same thing applies to the R5. Now that people are testing the R5 and saying, oh, it's the cards that are overheating, just take the cards out and then you can record externally and it never overheats. To me, that isn't a viable feature of the camera. It's a kind of sideways workaround to bypass the overheating issues that are plaguing the R5, but it's not in the camera's favor that you have to take the cards out and record externally just so it doesn't overheat. Like, that's a nice solution to a problem, but it's not a feature or a benefit. I actually like the way the additional weight helps the camera handle over the GH5. Everything just feels a bit more stable. That is true. The heavier the camera, usually the more stable the footage is going to just look and appear, because when you have more mass, it's going to take more movement to introduce movement in the frame. Same thing is true for your iPhone or any kind of small, even like a GoPro. If you try and hold a GoPro stable and you have the stabilization off, it's going to shake because the thing is so light and it just moves constantly. The Ursa Mini, even though it's called the Ursa Mini, is relatively large, and therefore even hand holding it, you get that kind of cinematic look and feel to the shots because you can just tell visually that it's a bigger, bulkier camera. So even though people will say, oh, the Ursa Mini doesn't, I don't know that many people would say this, it is a cinema camera, but it doesn't have internal stabilization, it doesn't have IBIS. Of course it doesn't, it's a cinema camera. Would it be nice? Yeah, that'd be great, but it doesn't have it. In any case, it usually doesn't matter because the movement that is there is far more cinematic, especially if it's on your shoulder where you got your center of gravity and you're getting movement that's like a lot bigger. And maybe that sounds bad, but like it's more sweeping. It's not the micro jitteriness you get with really lightweight DSLR hybrid type cameras, where a lot of times when those are handheld, you can see the person shaking, in the footage. And then of course the rolling shutter makes it jello and wobbly. So having a bigger camera, having a little bit more weight can be beneficial. But if you're getting the S1H for that ability to just hold it in your hand and run around and get photos, it is noticeably heavy. So if this were rigged out and I could put the weight on my shoulder, I think that would be less of a problem. But that's also not why you get a camera like this. You can do it, but again, not a built-in feature. Which codecs did I play around with? I played around with 4K, I might even have to pull it up, 4K, 10-bit, 422, all-I. That's basically, as far as I could tell, the highest quality recording mode in the camera. If you bump it up to 6K, you'll get more resolution, but then you take the hit and you don't have the 10-bit anymore. In fact, let me look, because there's so many options. In fact, it's even in the menu. I think it tells you how many there are. Now that we have a little bit of time, I'll go through this, and if there's any questions you want me to pull up or have me look into, or tell me a feature that I may have overlooked, please do, because the first thing I do whenever I get a new camera or any device, I don't look at the manual. Don't look at the manual. Go find and discover it on your own and literally go through every menu setting. Before I shoot anything, I go through the menu to make sure everything's the way I want, or at least the way I think I want. And then when you run into those problems, you can go, okay, is there a way to fix this? Like one of the first things I asked, it was actually on Dustin's live stream last night. He was doing a live stream, and I asked, is there a way to like make this shutter clicky and not so mushy? And he's like, no, I don't think there's a way to do that, which I didn't think there would be because it's a hardware feature, but I was like, maybe there's a menu setting where you can turn a click on or something. My only recommendation there to avoid the mushiness is just not have it in silent mode. It does feel a little bit better taking pictures, but in silent mode, it's super silent, and even the button is silent, which I actually find a little off-putting. Anyway, we were looking at codec. See, even that just started recording. So I just recorded a clip and didn't even really intend to, because there was a few times where I would try and half press the button, because that's a common thing I do on the GH5 to just like kind of wake it up or pop out of a menu, is like half press the shutter. But with the S1H, I found myself like I was trying to half press and I would full press because there isn't that click resistance there. Just a minor little nitpick. So if I go through and I go pick which codec I want on this thing, which I do have to get more familiar with the menus because they are different from the GH5. So they've kind of done like menu, sub-menu. I don't know if you can see that and how it all looks. This will be very difficult for me to navigate this backwards like this, but you can at least get a glance. Looks like the GH5 menu, but also very different. But kind of works the same way. It's very easy to pick up. So there are, you can go under, so all the record modes looks the same as the GH5. You can go scroll through the list and it's forever. But they have this display filtering, and of course that pops away. And back into the menu, there's this display filtering. And there are, see, I'm like hitting buttons and I'm not even intending to. It's recording and popping me out of menus. The display filtering option, you can see that you can filter down your codecs, and there's 42 different codec options. It's like, what is it, Baskin Robbins? How many flavors are Baskin Robbins? Is it 32? Oh, this is like Lumix, 42 flavors of codecs. So you can say, oh, I just want, the 60p frame rates, or I just want the 6K resolutions, or the 4K resolutions, or the Cinema 4K resolutions. You can have the codec, which is probably what I would filter by, because I don't think I would ever want to limit myself to just a resolution or just a frame rate. But say you wanted only the 422 10-bit all-I, which is like the most, like the highest end way you could record on this camera. That filters you down to 10 results, for example. So you could say, I only want 422 10-bit all-I, and you've only got those options. And then from there, you're top of the list, which apparently it just reset. Now your top of the list is 4K anamorphic 30, 42210 all-I, so all these are 42210 all-I, and then you've got 4K anamorphic 24, cinema 4K 30, cinema 4K 24, then you have 4K 30, 4K 24, full HD 60, full HD 60i, full HD 30p, full HD 24. Again, those are 422 10-bit all-I, and you can go filter by variable frame rate modes, and you can filter by hybrid log gamma, so the codecs that support the hybrid log gamma mode. It's really irritating going through all those codecs manually. There's 42. That's way too many. It should be resolution, frame rate, codec. How do you want it to record? So another thing I didn't mention before, but that also kind of caught me off guard, the GH5, I'm used to releasing the lens on this side of the camera, but there's no button here. It's just the record button down here, but there's no lens release. It's actually inside here with these kind of custom function buttons inside. So the lens release is just on the opposite side of the mount, which is kind of odd to get to because it's buried in there behind, deep inside the grip. These are minor nitpicks. It's just different than the GH5, but in practice, it seems like a harder spot to get to take a lens on and off. Almost every other system I'm thinking of, the lens release is on this side, so you push the button, twist it, pop another lens on. This one you have to kind of go between the lens and the grip and kind of get in there, whereas if you were like on set or something and it's on a tripod, typically it just seems like it's better on the other side. I don't know why, but I'm sure that's inherent to the mount and the way the mount is designed. So I would expect basically any L mount camera to have the lens release on that inside. Kind of annoying, kind of irritating, but it's not going to make or break the footage, right? It's not going to be the thing that like makes your project terrible just because the lens release is in kind of an awkward spot. But it's good to know because no one's going to tell you, and by the time you encounter it, you might be like, that might be the one feature that just really irritates you. So good to know. Let's see, back in the chat, which codecs do you play around with? So hopefully that answers that. There are 7 pages of codec choices. Yes, it's insane. You may also want to play with the remote Bluetooth app. It's surprisingly decent. So you do some nice wireless monitoring. So I do that on the GH5 frequently. I actually tried setting it up for this setup, and I do like that. I haven't tested on the S1H to see if it's real time. The original Panasonic image app seemed to transmit a little bit better video, like the live view, whereas the new one, it's like Lumix Sync. It connects better, which I like. This is the thing of like, I haven't tested the apps enough. Like to me, an app should be so simple that you just like open it and it just works. And unfortunately, camera manufacturers have the most clunky, unintuitive apps. The old Panasonic image app was always a chore to connect to. It seemed to like always like forget, and I'd have to like sign in again, and it was just kind of a nightmare to always get the camera to reconnect to the app every single time, and it would sometimes lose connection or things would freeze, kind of clunky. And that was with the GH4 and then into the GH5. It's such a helpful feature, but if the app doesn't work reliably, it's something that you just get used to like not using because you're like, oh, that's just too much hassle, I'm not going to bother. With the new app that I noticed on the App Store, I don't know when it came out. I've never seen anyone really talking about it, so maybe something I just missed, but I believe it's called Lumix Sync in the App Store. And that one, it prompts you right away to connect with Bluetooth first, which the old one, I would always connect with Wi-Fi. And the new one, it's like, oh, find Bluetooth, turn Bluetooth on, which I've never turned on my GH5 or GH4 because I didn't know you needed to. I don't even know if the GH4 had Bluetooth, but it's definitely on the GH5. And it says, oh, turn Bluetooth on your GH5, and then the Bluetooth sets up the pairing with the Wi-Fi, and then it does work more reliably and does connect more often. However, the live view doesn't seem as smooth and consistent. There's more of that stutter and delay. You can still record, you can still do autofocus, you can still change all your features, but it doesn't seem as smooth, particularly on my setup. Maybe it's my GH5, maybe it's my particular phone, maybe I just need to do a clean install or something. But for me, it's not the smooth, reliable signal that I would kind of get sometimes with the Panasonic Image app, the original one. Now with Lumix Sync, it's a little clunky, but I do like that it connects right away. So if you are looking for something like that with a Lumix camera, and Trevor is saying that the Bluetooth app for the S1H works well, I'll give it a test and see how it goes. Trevor says the latency is decently low. I hope so. My GH5, that is not the case. And it's not that it's the latency, it just is almost like the frame rate isn't keeping up. It's almost like like a couple frames a second. So it has that like jerkiness to it where you're trying to monitor in real time and it's just not quite there. Maybe the S1H does it a little bit better. You can create your own custom menu to include only the codecs you use the most. Yes, for sure. I'm sure there's a ton of ways to customize the S1H to make it more optimal to the way you like to shoot. Oftentimes, I don't like to do those sorts of things, and the reason being is if you are on a shoot with a crew and you have different cameras with different settings and different ways to do things, this even happens with changing. I typically like, and maybe it's because I learned on Canon DSLRs back in the day, but I typically like shutter on my index and aperture on my thumb. Lumix cameras by default are opposite, just like Nikon. And I don't know how Sony has it set, but I like how Canon does it, where there's aperture with the thumb, shutter with the index. For whatever reason, that just feels intuitive and natural. Every time I pick up a camera and it's backwards or the Lumix way, I deal with it and I go with it. And you can change it in the menu, but what's annoying is that if you have multiple GH5s or multiple S1Hs, they all have to have those same functions dialed in the same way, and then if one of them gets the firmware updated or reset or something, and then now you've got this rogue camera out there, and if you're trading cameras on a shoot, you've got people being like, wait, why is this broken? This isn't working. What's happening? How come this one doesn't work like that other one? And there's so many of those weird little features that you have to go through the menu to like turn on constant preview, to turn on, or to turn off the display for HDMI, or to turn on 10-bit for HDMI if that's what you want. Like all the little weird quirks that you need to make sure you go through every single menu item to make sure that they're consistent. Then to layer on top of that the different custom modes makes total sense for a personal, like independent shooter. If you're the one that's always using the camera and you know that C1 is this and C2 is that and C3 is that, but in general, when it's like a multi-shooter project and there's various hands on a camera, it is easier to have people familiar with how to just navigate it the stock mode. I'm not saying that's the most efficient way to do it. It's not going to be the fastest, but it can be the most reliable in a team environment. Back in the chat, it's on the right side. Do you have a Ninja 5? No, I don't have a Ninja 5. Right now, I have an Atomos Shogun Inferno setup, and I don't believe the Shogun Inferno supports ProRes RAW, but it might. I don't know. I haven't had a camera that can do it until now, because I don't believe the GH5 is getting that feature. So let's do Atomos Shogun Inferno ProRes RAW. I know the Ninja 5 is the like cheaper, newer, latest and greatest. So there's the Atomos Neon, 8K ProRes and ProRes RAW, future-proofed Inferno, record ProRes RAW. So maybe it is supported on the Shogun Inferno. I could test it out. Oftentimes, the file sizes are just so massive. So for like a long-form interview or a long standing like walk and talk or any kind of like talking segment, RAW can just be way overkill for the project. Granted, if you're making Lord of the Rings, go all out, go crazy. But for a lot of projects, there isn't the budget there to support just the file storage itself. You could theoretically be talking about multiple hard drives of depending on the project, it really depends, but multiple 20 terabyte hard drives. And then when you factor in backups, if you're rating things or if you have offsite storage, it can just be enormous files to back up and maintain. And granted, I'm sure a lot of people shoot footage grade it, and eventually they delete the original source material. I very rarely do that. In fact, I almost want to say I never delete source footage, just because I always like to have the original thing in its purest form. That way, if you ever need to go back, it's always there. And it's not like someone did like a bad color grade, blew away the original, and then all you have is their bad baked in color. That's like the worst thing, right? Because then you literally can't fix it. There, you can't go backwards. Is it better if you could go back to the raw? Yes, but do the budget support it? And oftentimes, no, they don't, because most of the time people don't have budgets for Lord of the Rings or, you know, some super high-end thing. Now, if you're doing commercial work and you're doing short little clips, absolutely shoot raw, do 8K raw, do whatever. Like, if you're doing little clips, fine, and your final product is a 30-second spot. This would be great for even like those like YouTube shorts where it's like, hey, here's how to get some really cool shots and, you know, like a little intro sequence or whatever. Go all out, make it look gorgeous. But for, you know, long form, a lot of the projects I end up on are kind of more in that documentaries, you know, as a documentarian in certain situations. You're doing longer form interviews, question answer type format, which I don't want to just be recording raw ProRes, you know, huge files for someone thinking through an answer, you know, and kind of spending time for a talking head segment, and maybe even two cameras, right? Oftentimes there will be two cameras for that setup, a wide and a close up. So then having both of those raw for a situation where you really only want the audio, because you're probably going to cover it with B-roll or graphics or something like that, but you can't just say, oh, I just want to record it audio, because then you may find a moment where you want to put them on camera. You know that dilemma, I'm sure you can probably relate, where you want the footage in case you have to use it, although you're probably not going to use it. Those are the situations where raw can be extreme overkill and just more trouble and money than it's worth. So really having a good solid, you know, codec that you can record for a long time, and it's not going to eat up your entire hard drive, but it's still good enough that it's going to grade decently well. It's got resolution. That's usually what I end up opting for, something in that kind of like middle to lower ground for that stuff. And then if it is just short little clips for like a commercial, let's say, that would be much more of like the let's go all out guns a-blazing, best we can get, because then we're going to really spend time dialing in that color for this specific sequence of shots. Other times, if it's generic B-roll, capturing stuff, and you're shooting high frame rate maybe for that stuff, it can just depend on what you're doing. Although I will say the higher the resolution, oftentimes like on the Ursa Mini or Ursa Mini Pro, if you're shooting 4K, you can a lot of times get by with even ProRes proxy if you really need the space and you're like, we need to film all day and get as much footage as we can. We don't have to have the absolute best quality. We just have to have as much as we can. ProRes proxy in 4K on the Ursa Mini is usable. I mean, it's called proxy, but a final viewer doesn't necessarily know unless it's just totally blown to smithereens with a color that's awful. But if you're shooting things pretty good in camera and your exposure's not too far over or too far under, or your color's totally out of whack, like if it looks good, like you can throw a grade on it and it'll stand up nice. However, that's not the case if you're shooting 1080. So with your lower resolution, you usually need a higher spec codec, like a ProRes Lite at least, because ProRes Proxy 1080, at least on the Ursa Mini is what I'm talking about, just looks like noticeably like proxy files. So it all depends on the situation, the environment, but does this say, set your set ablaze? Oh, I thought it said guns ablazing. I was like, oh my goodness, am I predicting the screen here? Maybe I saw it out of the corner of my eye. But it does say ProRes RAW with the Shogun Inferno. So that's great. 10-bit ProRes, great. Up to 4K 60. Yeah, excellent. So I could test that out with the S1H and see how it goes. Let's pop back into the chat here. Just catching up. Rumor source tells me the S1H has an extremely close relative sensor to the Sony FX9 sensor. Could be. I believe most of the Panasonic cameras feature Sony sensors, so it could be the FX9 or similar sensor. And then what's the purchase you most regret? Ooh, that's an interesting question. I don't know that I have anything that I truly regret. Because I'm usually the type of person, I want to get the best I can at the cheapest price. which oftentimes means you're not going to really regret it because you're not spending too much money. What do I don't, nothing comes to mind immediately off the top of my head of like a regret. I'm glad I bought the GH1 when I bought it because I hacked it and it was significantly cheaper than the 5D Mark II at the time, but the video quality was significantly better in terms of actual resolution, bitrate. So the GH1 was great. GH4 also fantastic. I never bought the GH2 or the GH3 because for me they didn't make sense. I did work with somebody who bought the GH2 at the time because I was such a fan of the GH1. He was like, "Oh, the GH2, this is just coming out. Should I get it?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." So we shot a bunch of stuff together. The GH4, love the GH4, and then the GH5, obvious upgrade. The lights I've purchased have either been the cheap lights that are like if they break it's no big deal, but the Aperture 300D Mark II, I love that light. It's super solid. It's actually this light right here, this little button. That's the 300D Mark II at 35%. I mean, this thing gets really, really bright. This is at 85%. 100%. It's incredibly powerful, especially if you put like a Fresnel on the front of it. If you need to throw it a little bit further, I don't think there's anything that I really regret. Maybe I bought, no, even back in the day I bought a Canon 60D for the photography aspects with the flip screen. I don't really regret that, and I don't have many. I'm sorry if that's a boring answer or not that satisfying, but the audio recorder that's on here is the Tascam DR60. I love that audio recorder. I think I prefer the DR70. I like there's the Tascam DR10. Is it the DR10? Like TR10L. Let's see, yeah, 10L. This thing is awesome. I love this little guy. So it's not wireless. It's just an audio recorder. So you put an SD card in it and it records to it, but it's just a mic. So it's basically a mic pack that records and doesn't transmit. So monitoring it can be a challenge. In fact, it's almost near impossible to actually monitor the thing live. You can, of course, monitor beforehand or after with headphones because you can't plug headphones into it, but you can't monitor live. However, if you mic up somebody properly, which isn't that hard to do, this thing sounds great. I hate wireless interference. Wireless microphones, no matter where you are, no matter what you do, that wireless interference of like, oh, you're a little bit too far away, or someone's phone goes off, or a plane goes by, or whatever wireless interruptions there are, and you get that crackle and the static and the pop, and that's all recorded into your camera, and then what do? I guess you just don't use that portion of the sound. The DR10L is, you don't have any of that wireless interference, right? Because it's recording right to the SD card. It can record for basically forever if you put a big enough SD card in it. I usually use 32s. It'll make it definitely a whole day. A lot of people use them for weddings, but you can use them for pretty much whatever you want and record really clean, good audio. It is a limitation, you can't monitor it. So in certain situations, if it's been a real priority, I'll do a wireless mic and one of these, so I have both. That way the wireless is transmitting, I can monitor, make sure there's no rustle or weird sounds, but then I know if there's any wireless interference or they just get too far away and I lose them or whatever the situation might be, that there's always audio recording for the main subject, which is very valuable oftentimes. Let's see, Shogun can only record ProRes RAW over SDI BNC cable and not HDMI. Ooh, thanks, Cliff. That's good to know, which the, S1H doesn't have SDI, unfortunately. Although that, I wouldn't, based on all the video features on this camera, it wouldn't surprise me if it somehow had SDI somewhere on it, where you're like, oh, wow, I didn't know I could even do that. So that's unfortunate that I can't actually test it then. Thank you, Cliff, for letting me know. But what cameras output RAW over SDI? I'd be curious to know. You're lucky you're happy with all your purchases. I have a drone I only used once. Interesting. the drone situation, Phantom 4 Pro Plus, I believe is the model. I wish I had a Mavic, I think, or something of that size to be a little bit more portable. It's always that thing of, do you want the quality or do you want the portability? I definitely don't need the Inspire, the giant one, although I am a certified drone pilot, which, by the way, if you haven't done that, FYI, it's at the FAA Part 107. It's a hassle. I don't want to say it's a nightmare, because it's doable. It's definitely doable. It's not hard. It's just really inconvenient. The amount of pilot aircraft information you need to know to fly a drone, which most of the time, if you're being smart with a drone, you're not doing dumb stuff with it. Like, hopefully you're not. Like, if you're a professional, treat your tools professionally. Like, I'm not going to do dumb stuff with the S1H. I'm not going to do dumb stuff with the GH5 or the Ursa Mini, and I'm not going to do dumb stuff with the drone. I understand why they want people to get the license and do all the things, but it's a lot of hoops to jump through, and it's a lot of information that isn't even helpful for flying a drone. It's helpful, I guess, if you're landing airplanes and you're near an airport and you have to know wind speed and how to find things on a map. Thankfully, Tony Northrup's video is pretty good about basically the things you need to know to pass the test. Watch that once, twice. Watch it again right before the test. I think his video's 2 hours. You can watch it the first time regular speed or maybe a little bit faster, and then the next times you can watch it like 2x speed. Makes it helpful just to like get all the numbers in your head. There's a lot of numbers and like how to read charts. And then a lot of the stuff on the test is stuff that you could, if you know the basics, if you know like the legend of on the maps and whatnot, you can kind of read it and figure it out with that kind of baseline information. So it's not impossible. Anyone could take it and anyone could pass it, but it's just unfortunate that they make you jump through those hoops. What camera am I using for the stream? Usually the clarity on streams are terrible. Well, Jeremy, this is the GH5. The GH5 is running through an Atomos Shogun Inferno, but that's just for monitoring. It's not actually essential to the setup. The HDMI goes into there, and then that goes into a cam link, which if you don't know what a cam link is, it's the magic to the whole equation. It's not a secret. A lot of people have these, but it's the Elgato cam link, and it's just a little HDMI to USB. So then your computer can recognize your GH5 as a webcam, and works out really well. And of course there's, you know, lights involved. So there's that light, there's a light overhead, softbox, and then the lighting in the background. But this is just 1080p, 30 frames a second. I tried a 60 frame stream because someone was talking about 24 being really choppy for a stream, and I totally get it. 24 I think looks nice recorded and posted after the fact, but 30 can, 60 is definitely smoother for a stream. I tried 60 though, but for whatever reason with the setup I had, it was glitching out. It had kind of like a frame sync issue that I found out as I started the stream, which is a great way to find problems in the moment. So anyway, I had to cancel that out, switch the camera to just 30 frames, and switch OBS to 30 frames, and everything seems to be working just fine now. Hopefully, but if anything looks or sounds bad, let me know. Sound is there's a microphone here. That is the Audix SCX1 HC. So that'd be one of these. It's a nice little hypercardioid microphone that isn't, it's not like the narrow shotgun microphone pattern, so it has a little bit of a broader pickup area. Specifically, I like it for talking rather than some of the issues you can get sound-wise with like a boom mic or shotgun mic. But anyway, that's just XLR to the Tascam DR60, which is the Tascam DR60. This is an older model. There's the 60 Mark II that has the red handles. Mine is the original because I bought it so long ago, but it still works, still holds up. Did have an issue with the XLR, got stuck in it. that was irritating to fix, but it basically just broke the locking mechanism. And this wasn't something that happened right away, so I had it for a long, long time. And then for whatever reason, that locking mechanism just like got stuck, locked, and like locked hard. Like I had to rip it out to get the XLR out. So anyway, yeah, I just piped into this and then out. And then the reason I do that is because I can do a low cut on the audio because I have some AC noise, some fan noise, just to keep all the background hum to a minimum. Have a low cut on there, filter all that out so there's not tons of bass. Pipe that into the GH5. GH5 sends audio video via HDMI, so everything's in sync. Sometimes if you're doing a stream, you might want to run the video into the laptop and then the audio into the laptop, especially if you have, which I have. So my old microphone, hold on, one second. So this is the microphone I used to use for my videos, and I would have it, in frame because it's a condenser microphone, so up close. I don't know, like everyone does that, and so I feel like it's kind of every video you see, long format podcast listening style content. I mean, you're listening to it, so it should sound the best, but let me know how this sounds compared to if you think I should have kind of the condenser in the frame, if that would be more pleasant to listen to rather than the way it is right now, which is more of like your filmmaker setup of having it, boomed overhead. So tell me what your thoughts are. I'd be curious if you want the condenser microphone podcast, like I'm talking right into the microphone here, or if this is the way to go. I do like the sound of this microphone. This is the MXL 990. This microphone sounds great, and people used to always comment of like, oh, yeah, it sounds great. What microphone is that? It's the MXL 990. Not super expensive. Of course, everybody has the Shure microphones now, like the Joe Rogan podcast, like in-your-face microphone. But like some of the cheaper microphones sound great too. So don't think you have to spend thousands of dollars just for a live stream, to have good audio. Like you can do it a lot of different ways. And it was bothering me that I didn't have the low cut in there the way I was doing it before with the Ursa. That way was nice because it was just the microphone XLR straight into the Ursa because it has XLR inputs. GH5 obviously doesn't have that, so I have to run it through an audio recorder first and then output over a stereo cable. It's one extra step, but because it's an audio recorder, it's got some of those extra audio filters in there. It makes it a little bit nicer and better sounding than just the straight audio through and then having that kind of like low-end rumble from the AC and the fan. I live in Phoenix and it's the middle of the summer. I don't want to have to turn my AC off or the fan off just to do a stream, because then people would be talking about why are you so sweaty all the time? It's like, well, because it's 100 degrees in here. So yeah, let me know how it sounds. Pop the chat back open here. I see what bit rate is this stream. The bit rate right now is 4,000 kilobits per second. And so 1080-30, 4,000 is the bit rate. I could probably bump it up higher because I've been recording. I've been recording for an hour and 20 minutes at 30 frames a second. I'm using 25% of the CPU, and I've dropped 0 frames this entire time, and I'm at 4,000 kilobits a second. Just FYI. Let's see. It sounds good like this. Hard to tell if it would sound better, but I'm not complaining. Hey, great. The condenser would give you that proximity effect radio sound. This way, with the overhead mic, sounds much more real and clear. Well, that's a question. Is like, is that enjoyable? Granted, like most of this content is about the talking. I'm not doing anything crazy, right? I'm not like we're not on a shoot right now, which is the funny thing about capturing quality YouTube content around filmmaking and production. It's very hard to do it properly because on a shoot, you're shooting something else. And then to spend time making YouTube content can be very difficult. So you see a lot of creators out there, they'll spend their time making specifically YouTube content. But when you're a smaller channel, that doesn't really make sense because it's like it doesn't justify the cost, with only a handful of people. And don't get me wrong, I enjoy hanging out with a handful of people because I can actually read the chat and it's not crazy and off the rails, and I like just hanging out and having a conversation. I like this style of content, but it is hard to capture a production, right? I was shooting today with the S1H if we had taken the time to do, hey, here's a cool video about the S1H and shooting with it, and here's some stuff, we wouldn't have been doing the project. So that's the tricky part, the balance, and why I kind of default to more of the talking head style for some of this stuff. I know it's inconvenient because you don't get to see any of the footage. Right now, at least, I'm trying to work out a way that I can do that a little bit better on these streams, so we can look at photos and videos a little bit more, like seeing the actual footage and what it actually is. But then oftentimes, if there's like a client involved, you know, for a professional project, like you run into some issues there in terms of like ownership and rights to the footage and whatnot. So it is a tricky area that I try and navigate in a way that makes sense for the size of my channel. It doesn't make sense to go all out and spend, you know, thousands of dollars making a YouTube video just for fun. I'd rather go get paid thousands of dollars to do work and then have, you know, like, am I paying money to make YouTube videos, or am I getting paid to make someone else videos? That's the kind of balance. And it's hard to do both because I can't be talking about what I'm shooting while I'm shooting it, because they're also probably talking to the camera. Whatever we're capturing usually has audio as well. So it's definitely a challenge being in that. And that's why you see the content over the years has developed and changed into more of the cinematic vlog storytelling reviews, the high end, like, look at this beautiful footage, look at this beautiful footage of the camera. My vlog looks great. My talking head part looks like everything looks great from the camera, but like that takes a lot of effort to invest in making that particular video. Like if I did that, you know, for every one of these, it wouldn't make sense financially. And also content wise, I just like more of the sit back, listen to it style content on YouTube anyway. And I don't know, I also enjoy it. I have plenty to talk about, that's for sure. I know people say that I rant and ramble and I keep saying the same thing, and you try talking on the fly perfectly for over an hour, keeping all the ums to a minimum and saying new thoughts every 10 seconds. It's a challenge, and it's one that I appreciate. I like the challenge of figuring out and getting better at it and working at it, because I know I always can get better, and I do like the feedback. I don't want to make boring videos that aren't helpful or informative. I want to be providing valuable insight from my personal perspective of projects I've worked on, things I've encountered, just all the knowledge that comes from experience. That's how you get some of the best lessons in life. And obviously not everyone can have each other's experiences. So if you share those with other people, hopefully they can learn some lessons without having to do it themselves, if that makes sense. Again, why I talk about some of like the negative aspects of the camera, or failures, or things to look out for, or problems that might come up. That way you don't have to suffer through those problems as well. Or if you're faced with a similar situation, you can kind of remember, oh yeah, here's a great workaround for this, and handle those problems as they come. So I don't know, as far as the condenser goes, just let me know if you want that sound. I'd be curious. For me, it's an aesthetic thing of, for that sound with the condenser microphone, it would be in frame, in which case then it looks more like a podcast, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I just chose not to do it for this particular setup, but that's how I used to do my videos years ago as well. I don't think there's a right or a wrong. It's just kind of what I was feeling inspired to do at the time. But as well as the GH5 that's recording right now, it's in the Cinelec V profile. This is the, here, I'll try and go through all the specs with visual so you have something to look at. It's the Lumix 20mm f1.7. This little pancake lens. This lens is awesome. It's so fun because it's so tiny and it is such a fast aperture. You got to remember with Micro Four Thirds, it is a smaller sensor, so you're not going to have that like the perceptible shallow depth of field, right? Yes, the depth of field doesn't change just because of the sensor, but in practice it does because it affects the way you shoot. If you have a smaller sensor, you're going to use different lenses and different positioning and all that stuff. Whole separate topic. But anyway, if you use a fast lens with Micro Four Third, you can get very, very close to the same look as you can with full frame using not quite as fast of lenses, which is typically how you're probably going to film anyway on a full frame camera. For example, the S1H here with the 24-70, that's a 2.8. 2.8 is still really, really shallow. So if you're shooting wide open with this, that would be on Micro Four Third, you would need like a 1.4 to get the same kind of depth of field. So it's basically like 2 stops different for the 2 times crop sensor size is the way the math sort of works out. So for a 2.8 on APS-C or Super 35, you would need like an f2, and then you would need a 1.4 lens on Micro Four Thirds, just because of the way the crops and the depth of field perception and everything how that all works out. So theoretically, this lens, the 20 millimeter 1.7, theoretically would be something like a 40 millimeter 2.8, which on this, would be like a nice pleasing image, and also very shallow. I'm not shooting it wide open though. I could and have a super shallow depth of field. I would need ND filters for the lighting setup in here that I have. I mean, it's not even that much light, but it's an insane amount of light. So right now I'm at f4 and my ISO is at 200. You can go down to 100 on the GH5, but it's like a low mode ISO that kind of clips off your highlights a little bit. It's not very aesthetically pleasing. So I usually don't shoot ISO 100 on the GH5. 200 is kind of the baseline. 200, f4, and then shutter obviously is 180 degree angle, shutter angle, and the lights, I could, like I showed, you can turn that 300D Mark II, the aperture LED light, you can turn it way up. So more than enough light, especially with the other lights. It gets very bright very quickly. So that's the settings on the camera that's doing the live stream. And then the picture profile I'm using is Cinelike V with a couple slight tweaks and white balance dialed in as something that I thought looked relatively nice. The initial setup I had for the live stream on some of the older ones was the Ursa Mini, which does look better. I would say it's a little bit smoother, a little bit nicer in terms of the skin tones and the overall dynamic range and color, but it's definitely overkill for a live stream too. Like an Ursa Mini for a live stream is kind of insane. And like I mentioned before, I wasn't able to introduce the low cut filter as easily as I can with this setup. So the Tascam does all the audio processing, GH5 does video, combine them in the GH5, send it over HDMI, and you're theoretically good to go as long as OBS doesn't crap out and the stream holds up, which so far there's 0 drop frames, still recording, still streaming 4,000 kilobits a second. So everything looks good. Hopefully it still sounds good. I haven't had an issue with it the nights I've been doing this. The only issue I ran into was that 60 frames per second, and it might just be a limitation of the cam link for whatever reason, it just being slightly out of sync or something, with like kind of one of those like frame glitches that happens every so often where it just doesn't quite line up and it needs to kind of reset itself. 30 looks good, 60 wasn't going, but my cam link is also the older one. It's not even the newer 4K one. So there's always more things to invest in and upgrade over time. Technology keeps getting better, and I'm sure one day we'll be streaming in 16K with 20 stops of dynamic range or something crazy, and that will look good too. And we'll look back at this old stuff and go, ooh, that looked terrible. Like these highlights on my face, I know they're bright, but that light is at 5%. Like it doesn't go lower. So it's that one. It's at 5%, it doesn't go lower, unfortunately. And if you can put diffusion on it, but then it changes the look of the light as well, and you don't get the same specular. So it is what it is. I know it could be more, it could be better. This is my home office. Apologies for not being perfectly dialed in. I'll whoever your favorite DP is, fill in the name of whose cinematography you like the best. Let's see. I appreciate the clarity of this setup. Clarity, do you mean my walkthrough explaining it or the sound of it? I like the overhead mic better. It sounds great. Great, good to know. What's the base native ISO on the GH5? So native ISO on the GH5, I don't know if there is like a native ISO. I know the lowest is 200. On the Ursa Mini Pro, like the base ISO is 800, and you can even see it where you switch to the different modes where like your highlights kind of stay the same and then your shadows just get darker. Like it's noticeable the way it affects the image. Things don't really get darker like the way they do exposure wise. I don't know if that makes sense. There's not a really good way to describe it. But on the GH5, if you're not in the log modes, if you're in log, the lowest ISO is 400. So I imagine that could theoretically be base ISO, or native ISO for the GH5 would be 400. But if you're shooting 400, 800 on the GH5, you're totally fine. On the S1H, the low end ISO is 640. in log mode. You can go down to 100 on the S1H, which I should say, and it's not a limited kind of low mode ISO at 100. It's just ISO 100. It says L before each of them, so you can kind of see the ones. Like there's an L50 ISO on here, so where you know like, oh, okay, that's like it's L.5, which is kind of their not a real ISO 50, but like punch down kind of thing. Same thing is true on the GH5, but that's how the 100 mode is. So it depends on how you're capturing color on the camera that affects what ISO values are available on the GH5. I usually use the kind of full stop increments, 200, 400, 800, 1600. Above that, and you're starting to stretch it a little thin and get some extra noise in there that if you don't have enough light can be kind of ugly to look at. And nothing below 200. If you're doing V-Log-L, then it's 400 and above. Talking about lighting, have you been able to play with any of the new Godox VL-FV series lights? No, but I've looked at them because they look awesome. They kind of have a cool style and just what the lights look like. They're these yellow, come on, find one. Don't give me like their old junk. We're looking for the VLFV. Yeah, these ones. These ones are cool looking. I like the styling. The yellow is kind of fun. But no, I haven't actually used them myself. But they're affordable, right? Aperture has done a great job of making quality lights, but they come with a higher price tag. There's also, what are the, you said VL or was it FV? Is that the other one? VL, FV. Yeah, so FV200, FV150. I'll look at these a little bit more because I have seen them and they look like really solid options for kind of more budget friendly if you're worried about the price of an aperture. I will say the 300D Mark II, it is not the brightest light in its class. A brighter one is the Nice Photo. I believe it's 300 something. This one, yeah, the 3300, 330 watt. This one is cheaper than the 300D Mark II, and it is brighter. I have tested it. One of my kind of video photography friends bought one of these because it's like half the price and wanted to test it out. It's a bright light. It is brighter than the 300D. The build quality, though, is much, much lower. So pick your poison. Do you not have any cash? You don't want to invest in a quality light, but you want the horsepower? Go for something like the Nice Photo or whatever. But I do like the aperture ones because they just the first, like the 120D Mark I's, the original 120Ds, a little bit cheaper, a little bit worse feel, but the 300D Mark II is built like a tank. It's rock solid and it works great, and I haven't had any issues with it. And I just like how everything is in the one box. You've got really long cords. If you haven't looked at the 300D Mark II, definitely check it out. But it's a very popular light, so I'm sure you're familiar with it. The 600D, I don't even know if those are out yet. They're probably not, but I know they've been announced. So it's a great time because there's really tons and tons of lighting options for a variety of price points, and they're all very bright. And the best part is, none of them get all that hot. Compared to, you know, old like 1K, 2K lights, where you basically like a whole circuit's power would be going to that one light, or even like HMIs. Like that stuff is just, it gets so hot, and there's just so much, just heats up the room. You can't touch them. It's really annoying. HMIs, you can't turn them off and turn them back on right away. LEDs, now that the CRI is a lot better and we've got stuff that's like very, very improved, very, very bright, very color accurate, it's definitely the way to go. And the thing about lights is I would recommend, even over cameras, the features improve in such a way that they become outdated very quickly, or the perception is they can be outdated very quickly. But a really good light is kind of like a really good tripod or like a really good microphone that it should last you a really, really long time. So if you're on the fence about, oh, should I get a good one? Should I spend a little bit more money? I'd say yes. If it's a light and you can justify the cost of like, you can't afford it, don't buy something you can't afford. Always. That's like rule number one. Don't buy it if you can't afford it. But if you can afford it, opt for the better one that's going to be with you in the long run, rather than one that maybe is going to break after a year or two because the build quality, there's a lot of plastic on it and it just doesn't hold up. Opt for the thing that's a little bit nicer, that has some longevity behind it, because you're not going to have to replace your lights nearly as much as you might think you have to replace your cameras. You don't have to replace your cameras all that often either, but there are some features, you know, in terms of frame rate, dynamic range, that do kind of make a difference in the here and now, whereas lights, if you get a good one, it should last you quite a while. Same thing with lenses. You know, really good lenses should last you quite a while. Problem with lenses is the mount and the system that you buy into. It is that like long-term commitment of, ooh, I went Canon RF, so now I have to have Canon RF cameras because I have all this glass that was really, really expensive. So I tend to like to go for like kind of the older lenses and adapt them, which is why I was such a fan of the GH1, the GH4, GH5. I mean, adapting lenses, which is kind of funny to think about, even back in the days of the GH1, you know, I was adapting old vintage like Nikon lenses and old Canon FD lenses, having this wide range of options available where everyone who was shooting with the 5D Mark II couldn't do that. You basically, it's like you have to use the EF lenses, because you can adapt Nikon lenses to Canon, but you can't adapt Canon to Nikon because of the flange distance. So having mirrorless for so long, it's such a, it's this luxury you can take for granted of just how easy it is to adapt older lenses that are still really good in a lot of ways, kind of fun and relatively affordable in some instances. And yeah, you might miss out on things like autofocus, but if you have like an aperture ring on there and you don't need the autofocus, a lot of it doesn't really matter. You just need the glass in front of the camera body, and at that case, you can find some older stuff that's, you know, cheaper but still really, really good. And that's one of the main reasons I went mirrorless in the first place. Let's see back in the chat. We talked about the Godox light. The clarity of the audio, however, the clarity of the explanation has been just as great. Oh, well, thanks, Jeremy. I'm glad the audio sounds good. I'm glad if this setup looks and sounds good, it's something that's relatively easy to maintain rather than, you know, something super complicated or something that I keep fiddling with. Did Panasonic give up on the EVA-1? I don't know that the EVA-1 ever had a chance or a shot. It seems like a camera targeted at a market that just doesn't exist anymore. I imagine the people who would have wanted an EVA-1 years ago all went hybrid. You know, this kind of like camcorder interchangeable thing. It's just, the price is just a little bit more expensive than what I think these types of shooters want, but it is cheaper and less than what most of the cinema style shooters want. So it's this weird in-between of the in-between that I just don't imagine there's a lot of people who the EVA-1 resonates with. Is it cool? Yeah, I like that Panasonic did it, but I don't know that there's going to be an EVA-2 because I don't know how many they sold. I mean, even on Amazon here, like, where's like the base one? Or let's go to B&H. That's probably a little better, because sometimes on Amazon there can be a ton of SKUs, and so looking at reviews is sometimes a challenge. So let's go to the EVA-1 on B&H and see how many user reviews there are. There's 24. I mean, which is not exceptional compared to the Ursa Mini Pro G2 already has 12 reviews. I should probably leave it a review. But you know, when you're looking at these two, basically similar price point, similar features right out of the box, I think people are going to opt for probably the Blackmagic, or they're going to go for the Canon or the Sony. There's the FS7, the FX9. The FX9 is more expensive, but the FS7, the FS5, there's a lot of the FS7 II. Yeah, so many SKUs. I didn't even realize there was a C300D Mark III. I was only aware of the Mark II, but now there's a Mark III apparently. If you're not tracking all of these all the time, shame on you, shame on me. No, not at all. There's so many cameras, and there's more and more seemingly every month, to where even if you get into like even the consumer end stuff, like all the Lumix. I mean, there's the GH5 and the GH5S, but then there's what, the G9, the G85, the GX. It's just overwhelming. And then to know all the Fuji ones and all the Olympus ones, and then, hey, remember the Samsung NX1? Is that what it was called? I think it was the NX1. That was a really cool camera. But then Samsung abandoned that and ditched that. NX1, yeah. The NX1 was really cool. I rented it one time and enjoyed it for what it was, but also ended up sticking with the GH cameras. Because there was some goofy stuff with the NX1. The codec, it wasn't quite ready for editing. It was just, the camera was kind of too advanced for its time. Systems weren't ready for the H.265 implementation they went with. So it was a little bit hard to edit. But cool camera. I mean, I wonder if you could, maybe it's like that right time to get an NX1. If you were ever curious, it might be right at the time where they're cheap before they get expensive again. You know how everything does that? Like it depreciates in value until it gets to the point where it's like rare and then people want it again. Maybe pick up an NX1. $2,000. Oh my goodness, $8,500. Whoa. Apparently they still sell like hotcakes. I don't know. Cool camera. A little bit outdated now in terms of features, but at the time, really cool stuff. Let's see. What else is going on in the chat? Yeah, the FV model is a combo system, constant lighting with strobe. However, there's supposedly some issues with the cooling fan noises. So would you then recommend, you said the VL, is that more of the video? VL is better than the FV, or is I don't know, which one's better? I don't know much about the Godox lights, but I'll check them out. I just picked up a set of contact Zeiss lenses for my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema, 6K, the things are incredible. Absolutely. If you can find, like there's some, granted, they're still expensive, you know, if they're good lenses, they should last a lifetime. No, they'll hold up over time. They'll be really good. So older Zeiss lenses, still really nice. They're gonna still be expensive, but the quality is there, and they are gonna be probably cheaper than maybe some of the more modern electronic counterparts. It just depends on how you shoot and what your priorities are. If autofocus is a big need, then like you're probably gonna want the native lenses for the mount. In which case, if it's a Sony camera, you're gonna want Sony lenses. If it's a Canon camera, you're gonna want Canon lenses, because the autofocus is most likely gonna work the best with the native glass. If autofocus isn't a feature and you don't need image stabilization either, as long as it has an aperture that you can adjust on the lens, you can put on any camera you want, which is basically the way I think you should buy lenses whenever possible. If you're gonna invest thousands of dollars in a lens system, make sure that it's gonna last quite a while. So EF lenses will last a while. However, you may not want the electronic ones. It depends on the system, but like the Zine, you know, Cine lenses, or like the Rokinon is kind of like the cheaper version, but the Zine ones are really nice because you have, you know, manual focus, manual aperture, and they're cinema lenses. Granted, it can be harder to shoot with cinema lenses in certain situations if you need something with filters without a matte box. So in that case, going for the Rokinon version would probably be better. Or there's plenty of other lens companies, not just Rokinon, but in getting something like a 35 1.4, which I had at one point, which was a really nice lens, and then I sold it because I didn't need it anymore. Or like an 85. Like there's just so much good stuff out there, and the main hesitation is around the electronics. That's my biggest thing, is I want to make sure if there's electronic components to the lens, then I'm kind of married to that system electronically with the camera. So then I have to get the electronic adapters rather than just the dummy adapters, and which can end up saving you money in the long run, but you might miss out on certain features. So it's kind of like pick your poison. But basically every lens I have, even the old Nikon ones, even the old Canon ones, for the most part I can use still to this day, you know, and over time you just keep adding more lenses. So gosh, Plenty of lenses to choose from. Plenty of lenses. The C300 Mark III has dual gain output similar to the Arri. Insane dynamic range. I'm sure it does. Probably a great camera. I have nothing bad to say about it. I'm not sure if the GH5 is the same, but the GH5S native ISO on profiles is 400, 2500, and Vlog HLG native ISO is 800, 5000. The GH5 is not the same as the GH5S, so I imagine they're a little different in that regard. It's in terms of like just native ISO. Let's see, GH5 profiles is 400, 2500, yeah, and for vlog it's 800, which I believe in. I don't know the native ISO for the GH5, but the lowest you can go in Vlog L is 400. So if the lowest, I don't know if you're saying the lowest you can go on the GH5S is 800, but great to see you online again lately. I subbed you all those years ago when I bought my GH4 the week it came out. Likewise, I believe I was in Vegas for a shoot when I got my GH4, and that's when I shot all my first test footage with the GH4. That was a long, long time ago. Let's see. Let's see the original one. Oh, where's my original? I've done a lot of GH4, GH5 content over the years. Funny. Like I can't find the original. There's the JVC LS300 review. I spent a lot of time on that one. I spent a ton of time on the GH5 review. The GH4 review though, where is it at? I did a test with the A7S versus the GH4 because that was the big debate at the time. Talking about the Speed Booster XL. Man, I made so many videos years ago. So many videos. The Video Assist 4K review, cinema lenses, the GH5 menu, Ursa Mini 4.6K test footage. Oh, so here you go. You want to see some fun? This is the original Ursa Mini 4.6K. So this is not the Pro.
Project our crew was working on. So I thought I'd share my thoughts.
Where's that backpack? So I was with David. So this is David and Christopher. This is in Chicago. We're shooting with the Ursa Mini 4.6K. Where is that backpack? Because I want to show you this thing about the Ursa Mini 4.6K. Let me see. Come on. Is it at the beginning? I just saw it in the thumbnail preview. It played it, but then it didn't pop up here. Where's it at? There it is. Okay, perfect. Found it. Here we go. So yeah, this backpack is black. Let's see, and that lady's shirt is probably black. So that backpack, hopefully you can see this, looks maroon, right, in the footage, and that's from IR pollution. Blackmagic fixed this, but this was a main problem on the Ursa Mini. The original 4.6K one is that with NDs you get a lot of infrared pollution, turning things like the backpack that's black, it would turn like pink or maroon. Again, fixed on the G1 and the G2, the Pro Ursa Mini, but you'd have to have like an IR cut filter in addition to whenever you're doing any kind of like ND work with the Ursa Mini. And the original Ursa Mini 4.68 didn't have the built-in NDs either, so you usually have to have the ND filter on there along with an IR cut filter. It was just extra steps to like solve problems. Beautiful camera, great camera at the time. Still to this day, you know, I'm sure, like, you know, people always talk about the A7S being good and in low light and stuff, but like, this is the Ursa Mini, the original one in low light, and granted, it's like the city, so there is light, but I wouldn't say that that's a bad low light camera. How low light do you need to go? You know, like we're past that point with most cameras. So the A7S Mark III, I'm sure it's even better in low light, and that's fantastic for when you need it. But a lot of cameras do really well in low light nowadays, even if they are the ones that do bad in low light. It's the same thing with autofocus. People will say the S1H has terrible autofocus, and that's not true. It's just not as good as some of the other ones. So, you know, it's not like the Ursa Mini was or is a bad camera in low light. It's just not as good as the A7S. And I'd say the same thing for the GH4 and the GH5. Yeah, they're not as good as the A7S, but that doesn't mean they're bad either. So always just stuff to keep in mind. Things keep getting better. All the cameras across the board keep improving. So as long as we're not going backwards, that's the only thing. Let's see. Cool. I think I'll wrap this up. Unless there's anything else we should talk about. But yeah, I still don't see my GH4 review. Where is the GH4 review? I know I published it. That's got to be one of the, it should be probably one of the earlier videos on my channel. Let's go oldest. Because that's not even, that's, I mean, we're going to get to some old stuff. But here it is. Oh, I called it first impressions and test footage 6 years ago. The test was on a shoot in Las Vegas. Yeah, that's funny. You know, like I like making these videos over time because you like remember. It's just like it brings you back in the same way that photos do. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I didn't even have the real speed boosters, the cheap one. I do have the real Metabones now, but back then it was like, get the best I can with the cheapest possible, and it was the $100 knockoff speed booster. I wonder who that guy is. Where do you think he is now? 6 years. Some random dude on an airplane. So, oh yeah, we were trying to do all the, trying to get log out of the GH4 because it didn't, you know, Cinelec D, Cinelec V. Typically on the GH cameras, I end up going with Cinelec V in general. It's just kind of good baseline. That's what this is right now. And yeah, you can still, great, still watch it in 4K 6 years later, all this time. That's beautiful. It's the beauty of having a, it was a GH4, $1,600 when it came out. And like, again, you know, this is the GH4, not known for being a great low light camera, but how much lower light do you need? I mean, this is nighttime. Granted, there's lights there, but what do you want it to look like? This is the kind of illusion with most of these cameras. They say, oh, it's great in low light. Well, how much lower is it going to get? And it's, you know, seemingly there all those years ago, 6 years ago with the GH4, kind of already doing it. So yeah, that's super clean. Do you need something that does better? Maybe if you're shooting in pitch black, but even then you're going to need some light to see something. So all just kind of the way that the tricks that get played on you over time of, look at this low light footage. It's like, yeah, but just remember, like 2 or 3, 4 years ago, we were looking at low light footage then, and it blew our minds then too. So is this significantly better? Just, is it the same? Slightly better? Depends on what you're shooting and how you're shooting it, but I'll end it there. Thanks for hanging out, and I can't wait to continue using the S1H. It's a really fun camera, and I'm very pleased with how the footage looks so far. Taking photos on it, aside from the mushy trigger, also very satisfying. The photography, not the mushy trigger. The photos are satisfying, and I'm looking forward to doing more and having some more sample photos and footage to kind of go over and evaluate at some point in the time in the near future. I only have this for a few more days, so hopefully can make the most of it and get some good stuff. Later.